Honestly, Brenda, I just don't feel comfortable with him sitting up front." The words, spoken in a low conspiratorial whisper, dripped with the kind of casual venom that starts wars. On board a private Gulfstream, G650, 30,000 feet in the air, those words weren't aimed at an enemy soldier, but at a man in a $2,000 suit, sitting in a seat he had paid for seat 1A. The speaker was a wealthy legacy client. The target was a black CEO. But what no one on that plane knew was that the quiet man in seat 1A wasn't just a passenger. He was about to become their boss, their judge, and their executioner. This isn't just a story about racism. It's a story of what happens when prejudice collides with ultimate power, and how one man's quiet humiliation led to him firing an entire crew and dismantling an empire all before his jet even landed. The air inside the Prestige Air Charter Terminal in Teterboro, New Jersey, was different. It was rarefied smelling of expensive leather fresh coffee and an unspoken sense of importance. This was the natural habitat of Martin Thorne, though you wouldn't know it by the quiet way he carried himself. At 42, he possessed a stillness that was often mistaken for aloofness. It was in reality the hyper-focused calm of a man who ran Etherion Analytics, a tech behemoth that had revolutionized predictive AI, and in the process, made him a billionaire twice over. Today's flight was critical, a 7-hour hop to Zurich for a final handshake on the acquisition of a Swiss robotics firm, a deal that would cement Etherion's dominance for the next decade. He traveled light, a single leather carry-on, holding his laptop and a change of clothes. He valued efficiency over extravagance. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." The concierge greeted him, her smile practiced and perfect. "The crew for your flight to Zurich is ready. We have you in seat 1A as requested." "Thank you, Amelia," Martin replied, his voice a smooth baritone. Seat 1A was his preference not for status, but for solitude. It was the single seat at the front of the Gulfstream's main cabin, offering the most privacy and space. It was his airborne office, a sanctuary where he could work, uninterrupted. He walked across the polished tarmac, the sleek white fuselage of the G650 gleaming under the morning sun. He ascended the stairs and was met at the door by the lead flight attendant. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thorne," she said, her smile a little too bright, a little too forced. Her name tag read, "Brenda." "I'm Brenda, and I'll be your cabin attendant today. Can I get you a drink before we depart? Some champagne, perhaps?" "Just water for now, thank you, Brenda," Martin said, moving past her toward his seat. He settled into the plush cream leather of seat 1A, the cabin an oasis of beige and polished mahogany. He placed his bag in the adjacent empty space and pulled out his tablet. The door to the cockpit was open, and he gave a brief nod to the two pilots, a grizzled older man and his younger co-pilot. They nodded back, already engrossed in their pre-flight checks. For 20 minutes, the cabin was his. The silence was productive. He reviewed the final points of the acquisition, his mind mapping out conversational pathways and potential sticking points. The quiet hum of the auxiliary power unit was a familiar, comforting sound. Then the calm was broken. The sound of hurried footsteps on the air stairs, followed by a loud, brash voice. Sorry, traffic was a nightmare. Sterling is here, no need to panic." A man in his late 50s appeared at the doorway. He was dressed in a golf shirt and expensive slacks, his face florid, his silver hair swept back with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. This was Harrison Sterling. Martin recognized him from financial news segments, the head of Sterling Holdings, a mid-tier private equity firm, known for aggressive, often ruthless takeovers. Sterling wasn't scheduled to be on this flight. Martin had chartered the entire jet. This was a ghost flight, meaning he was the sole passenger booked. Prestige Air must have made a last-minute addition, likely for a high-value client who needed an urgent ride. Martin felt a flicker of annoyance. His solitude was compromised, but it wasn't a deal-breaker. Sterling handed his carry-on to Brenda without a glance, his eyes scanning the cabin. He saw Martin in Seat 1A. A brief, almost imperceptible frown crossed his face. He leaned in close to Brenda, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but one that carried easily in the quiet cabin. "Honestly, Brenda," Sterling murmured, his tone laced with a sarcastic, dismissive edge. "I just don't feel comfortable with him sitting up front." The word him hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It wasn't a shout. It was a pinprick, a small poisoned dart aimed directly at Martin. It was the kind of comment designed to be deniable, to be brushed off as a misunderstanding, but its intent was as clear as the plexiglass window beside him. Martin didn't react. He didn't look up from his tablet. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed. But inside a cold, familiar switch flipped. He had heard variations of that sentiment his entire life, in boardrooms, on golf courses, in luxury stores. It was the quiet assumption that he was out of place, that his presence in a space of power and privilege was an anomaly, an error to be corrected. He watched Brenda's reaction out of the corner of his eye. Her professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She glanced from Sterling, a client whose company had been a Prestige Air patron for over a decade, to Martin, a newer but incredibly wealthy client. A choice was being made in her mind. A calculation of power, loyalty, and convenience. Her moment of hesitation passed. She put on her customer service face, a mask of accommodating grace, and turned her attention not to the man who made the comment, but to the man who was its subject. She took a deep breath and walked toward Seat 1A. The drama had begun. Brenda approached Seat 1A with the practiced gait of someone about to deliver inconvenient news with a smile. She stopped beside Martin, clasping her hands in front of her. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice a little too sweet, "I am so sorry for the disturbance. We had a last-minute addition to the flight, Mr. Sterling." Martin finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes calm and direct. "So I see. Yes, well." Brenda continued, a slight flutter in her voice. "Mr. Sterling is one of our longest-standing clients, and he has a particular preference for this seat." Martin held her gaze, letting the silence stretch. He didn't help her. He didn't fill the awkward pause. He simply waited for her to say what she came to say. "He finds it helps with his flight anxiety." She added the lie, thin and unconvincing. "We were wondering if you would be so kind as to switch to Seat 4A. It's an identical seat, just a bit further back." Martin looked past her for a moment, at Harrison Sterling, who was now pointedly examining a magazine, feigning disinterest. He knew what this was. It wasn't about flight anxiety. It wasn't about a seating preference. It was about the unspoken, ugly truth in Sterling's earlier whisper. It was about a white man not wanting a black man to have the premier position. He turned his attention back to Brenda. "I requested and paid for this specific seat, Brenda. I have work to do, and I chose it for its privacy." His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for negotiation. "I'll be staying here." Brenda's smile tightened. This was not the easy capitulation she had expected. She was used to passengers being accommodating, especially when the request was framed as a favor to the crew. "Sir, I understand, but as a gesture of goodwill to another valued passenger. Is Mr. Sterling's goodwill more valuable than mine?" Martin asked the question, sharp and precise. "I chartered this aircraft. My understanding was that I would be the sole passenger. Your company adding another passenger without my consent is already a breach of that expectation. Asking me to move from the seat I specifically reserved is compounding the issue. Brenda was flustered. She was a flight attendant, not a contract lawyer. She fell back on her training, which was to de-escalate and control the cabin. In her mind, the path of least resistance was to appease Sterling. "It's just a simple seating change, sir," she said, her voice taking on a patronizing edge. "There's no need to make this a difficult situation." "I'm not the one making it difficult," Martin replied coolly. "I'm simply sitting in the seat I am assigned. The difficulty seems to be stemming from Mr. Sterling's discomfort." From across the cabin, Sterling chimed in his voice, loud and condescending. "Look, pal, it's the best seat on the plane. I always sit there. It's not a big deal. Just move." The use of the word pal was like gasoline on a spark. It was dismissive, infantilizing. Martin felt a surge of hot anger, but he suppressed it, compressing it into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. Showing anger was what they expected. It would, in their minds, justify their actions. Calmness was his weapon. "My name is Mr. Thorne," Martin said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a new weight of authority. "And I will not be moving." Brenda looked desperately between the two men. On one side, an immovable object. On the other, an entitled long-term client who was now scowling openly. She made another poor calculation. She decided to escalate. "I'm going to have to ask the captain to speak with you," she said, her tone now clipped and official. "Please do," Martin said, and he returned his gaze to his tablet, effectively dismissing her. The message was clear. This conversation was over. Brenda, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, spun on her heel and marched toward the cockpit. Martin could hear her speaking in hushed, urgent tones with the pilots. He knew what would happen next. The captain, a man whose primary concern was an on-time departure and a smooth flight, would almost certainly side with the path of least resistance. He would try to resolve the situation by pressuring the passenger, who seemed, on the surface, to have less institutional leverage. They saw a black man, even one in a fine suit, and they saw a problem to be managed, not a client to be respected. A few moments later, Captain Miller emerged. He was a man in his late 50s, with a weathered face and an air of weary command. He did not look happy. He strode down the aisle and stood over Martin, his arms crossed. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice a low rumble. "Brenda tells me we have a seating issue." "There is no issue," Martin replied, not looking up. "There is a request which I have declined." "Son," the captain said, the word dripping with condescension. "We have a tight schedule. Mr. Sterling always sits here. It's easier for everyone if you just move to 4A. Let's not delay our departure to Zurich over something so trivial." Trivial. The word stung more than Paul. His dignity, the blatant racism, the contractual agreement for his seat, all of it was trivial in the face of their convenience. Martin finally lifted his head, and for the first time, he let a sliver of the cold fury show in his eyes. "Captain, with all due respect, my presence in this seat is not a matter for a crew vote. It is a paid-for-confirmed reservation. Are you telling me that you will not honor it?" The captain's face hardened. He was used to his authority being absolute on an aircraft. "I am the captain of this plane, and I have final say on all seating arrangements for the safety and comfort of my passengers. I am now instructing you to move to seat 4A. "On what grounds?" Martin challenged. "Is my presence here a threat to safety?" "The comfort of the passengers," Captain Miller repeated, his voice strained. "Mr. Sterling is not comfortable." "And I am," Martin stated flatly. "It seems we are at an impasse." The captain took a deep breath, his patience clearly gone. "Sir, you can either move to the other seat, or we can have you removed from the flight for failing to comply with a crew instruction. The choice is yours." We need to close the door. It was the ultimate threat. Humiliation or expulsion. Martin looked at the captain's determined face. He looked at Brenda standing behind him with a look of vindicated triumph. He looked at Sterling, who was now smirking, openly enjoying the show. He saw it all with perfect, painful clarity. This wasn't a fight he could win right now, not on their terms. To be dragged off the plane would create a scene, jeopardize his deal in Zurich, and feed into a racist narrative. They had cornered him. But as they stood there, basking in their petty victory, they had no idea what they had just set in motion. They thought they were just moving a passenger. They didn't realize they were arming him. Martin slowly, deliberately closed his tablet. A cold, quiet plan was already forming in his mind. A plan of breathtaking consequence. He would move. For now. Fine, Martin said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He picked up his carry-on bag and his tablet. He stood up the motion, graceful and controlled, betraying none of the fury raging within him. He walked past the smirking Sterling and the triumphant crew to seat 4A. As he sat down, the shame and humiliation were a physical weight. But beneath it, something else was taking root, a chilling, absolute resolve. The game was not over. It had just begun. And he was about to change the rules. As the Gulfstream's powerful engines spooled up and the jet began its taxi to the runway, a new atmosphere settled into the cabin. It was an air of victory for 3 people and one of cold fury for the 4th. Harrison Sterling stretched out in seat 1A, accepting a glass of champagne from a fawning Brenda. He raised his glass in a mock toast towards Martin, a smug, contemptuous grin on his face. Martin ignored him, his gaze fixed on the screen of his tablet. To the crew he now looked like a sulking, defeated man. They saw him tapping away on his screen and assumed he was venting to a friend or a lawyer. They couldn't have been more wrong. Martin Thorne wasn't venting. He was working. The humiliation was a fire in his gut, but his mind was an ice-cold machine. He had built Etherean analytics by seeing patterns others missed, by turning data into decisive action. And right now he was collecting data. Data point 1, Brenda Lead, flight attendant, the primary instigator. She had prioritized the prejudice of a legacy client over protocol and basic human decency. She had lied about flight anxiety and had been the one to escalate the situation to the captain. Her failure was one of active participation. Data point 2. Captain Miller, the authority figure who abused his power. His use of son and trivial revealed his bias. He chose the easy path, not the right one, and used the threat of removal to enforce a racist whim. His failure was one of complicit enforcement. Data point 3. Co-pilot Davis. Silent complicity. He had watched the entire exchange from the cockpit doorway and had done nothing. He had said nothing. He had backed his captain without question, failing the first test of leadership moral courage. His failure was one of passive agreement. Data point 4. Harrison Sterling, the catalyst, an arrogant bigot whose sense of entitlement was the spark that lit the fuse. He was a symptom of a larger disease. Data point 5. Prestige Air Charter, the system that allowed this to happen. A culture that empowered a flight attendant and captain to act this way must be rotten at its core. If they could treat a billionaire client this way, how did they treat others? Their failure was systemic. As the plane climbed to its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet, Martin connected to the jet's satellite Wi-Fi. The signal was strong, and his fingers flew across the screen. He wasn't emailing his board of directors or his legal team. His first message was to a very different kind of contact. He sent a secure, encrypted message to his chief financial officer, David Chen, A man renowned for his speed and discretion. M.T. David. The Prestige Air deal. Is it ready to close? A reply came back in under a minute. D.C. Martin. Yes. Final papers are drawn. Just need your digital signature. I thought you wanted to wait until after the Zurich trip to pull the trigger. This was the twist, the spectacular hidden ace up Martin's sleeve. For the past 6 months, Etherian Analytics, through a discreet subsidiary holding company, had been in quiet negotiations to acquire Prestige Air Charter. The charter company was financially over-leveraged, a fact Etherian's AI had flagged as a prime investment opportunity. The plan was to acquire it, streamline its operations, and integrate it into Etherian's corporate logistics wing. Martin had been on the fence about the final price planning to make a decision next week. The events of the last hour had made the decision for him. It was no longer just a business transaction. It had become personal. MT circumstances have changed. The price is no longer an issue. Send me the documents. I'm signing now. DC understood. Sending via secure portal. A link appeared on his screen. Martin opened the multi-$100 million acquisition contract. He scrolled through the pages, his eyes scanning the legal jargon he already knew by heart. He found the signature line. With a tap of his stylus, the digital signature of Martin Thorne was affixed. He sent it back. DC confirmed. It's done. We are wiring the funds from the escrow account. By the time you land in Zurich, Prestige Air Charter and all its assets, liabilities, and employees will be a fully owned subsidiary of Etherian Holdings. Congratulations. Or should I be concerned, MT no concern. Just business. Now I need you to do something else. Get me the complete employee files for the crew of flight PAC 7471 Teterboro to Zurich. Captain, co-pilot, and all cabin attendants. I want their full names, service records, everything. And David, be discreet. DC already on it. You'll have it within the hour. Martin leaned his head back against the seat. The first most important step was complete. He was no longer just a wronged passenger. He was the owner. The feeling was not one of triumph, not yet. It was the feeling of a weapon being loaded and cocked. For the next hour he ignored the occasional clinking of glasses from the front of the cabin where Brenda was catering to Sterling's every whim. He ignored their loud conversation, their laughter. He was in his own world, a world of strategy and impending consequence. As promised, a file arrived from David Chen. It contained everything. Captain Frank Miller, age 58, 30 years of experience, a decorated Air Force veteran. A few minor complaints on his record for being gruff with clients, but nothing official. Divorced, 2 kids in college. Mortgage on a house in Connecticut. Co-pilot Robert Davis, age 34. Ambitious clean record, top of his flight school class. Recently married, eager to make captain. Flight attendant Brenda O'Malley, age 45. 20 years with various charter companies. Consistently high marks for client satisfaction, especially with long-term male clients. Single, lives in a condo in Fort Lee. He read their files not with empathy, but with the cold detachment of a general studying an enemy's dossier. These were no longer people to him. They were liabilities. They were the personification of the rot he had just purchased. And rot needed to be cut out. He spent the next few hours of the flight drafting a series of emails and memos. The first was to the now former CEO of Prestige Air Charter, informing him of the ownership change and instructing him to make a public announcement at 9:00 a.m. Eastern Time. The second was to Etherian's formidable head of HR, outlining the creation of a new code of conduct for the aviation subsidiary, with zero-tolerance policies on discrimination of any kind. The third was a memo to be distributed to all remaining Prestige Air staff, announcing a change in leadership and a complete operational review. He was not just firing a crew, he was surgically dismantling the culture that created them. As the plane began its descent into Zurich, the chime sounded for the crew to prepare for landing. Brenda walked through the cabin, her movements brisk and professional. She paused by Martin's seat. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice holding that same fake politeness. "Could you please ensure your tablet is secured for landing?" Martin looked up at her. He didn't say a word. He simply held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in her eyes. The man looking back at her was not the same one she had forced to move hours ago. This man's eyes held a chilling, absolute certainty. He slowly put his tablet away. The wheels of the Gulfstream touched down on the tarmac of Zurich Airport with a gentle squeal. The flight was over. The journey was over. But the reckoning was just about to begin. The Gulfstream G650 taxied to a private terminal at Zurich Airport, its engines whining down to a gentle hum. Outside, the Swiss morning was crisp and grey. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Harrison Sterling was on his phone, already barking orders at some subordinate back in the States. Brenda and the other more junior flight attendant were preparing the cabin for disembarkation. Martin Thorne remained seated, a portrait of unnerving patience. He watched as the ground crew connected the airstairs. Brenda approached Sterling's seat. "Mr. Sterling, we're ready for you to deplane whenever you wish. Excellent, Brenda. Excellent service as always." Sterling boomed, snapping his phone shut. He shot a final triumphant smirk in Martin's direction as he grabbed his bag and headed for the door. He paused on the top step, breathing in the Swiss air like a conqueror. Martin waited until Sterling was completely off the plane and out of earshot. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt. But instead of walking towards the exit, he walked towards the cockpit. Brenda, surprised, moved to intercept him. "Sir, the exit is this way. The captain and co-pilot are running their post-flight checklists." "I know," Martin said, his voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight of command. He didn't stop. He walked right past her. "I need to have a word with them, and with you, in the cockpit. Now." His tone brooked no argument. Confused and a little intimidated, Brenda followed him. The junior flight attendant watched bewildered from the galley. Martin stepped into the cramped cockpit. Captain Miller and co-pilot Davis looked up, annoyed by the intrusion. "Sir, this is a restricted area," Captain Miller said, his voice sharp with irritation. "You need to deplane." "Take a seat, Captain," Martin said. It was not a request. He pointed to the small jump seat in the cockpit. "Brenda, you too. Close the door." Completely thrown by this turn of events, they complied. The cockpit door clicked shut, sealing the four of them inside. The space was tight, claustrophobic. Captain Miller found his voice first. "What is the meaning of this? You have no authority here. You were already disruptive on this flight, and I will be filing a formal complaint with Prestige." Martin allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. "I don't think you will," he said softly. As of 9:00 a.m. Eastern Time today, about 3 hours ago, Prestige Air Charter was formally acquired. Its new parent company is Etherian Holdings. He paused, letting the information sink in. He saw the flicker of confusion in their eyes. They didn't understand the connection. "My name," he continued, savoring the moment, "is Martin Thorne. I am the founder and CEO of Etherian Holdings." The silence in the cockpit was absolute. It was a silence filled with the deafening sound of careers imploding. The blood drained from Captain Miller's face. Co-pilot Davis stared, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a fish out of water. Brenda's professional mask shattered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. That's not possible," Miller stammered. "I assure you it is," Martin said, his voice like chips of ice. "You can check the financial news wires, or you can take my word for it. The word of the man who now owns this plane, your contracts and your futures." He looked directly at Brenda. "Brenda O'Malley, you made a choice today. You chose to placate the prejudice of one man over the dignity of another. You chose to enforce a racist request. Your employment with my company is terminated effective immediately. Your flight licenses and certifications will be subject to a full review based on your conduct. You will be flown back to the United States in coach on a commercial flight tomorrow. You are not to set foot on one of my aircraft again." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. Tears welled in her eyes. Martin then turned to co-pilot Robert Davis. You stood by and said nothing. You watched a paying client be humiliated and did nothing. You failed the most basic test of character. Your complicity makes you just as guilty. Your employment is also terminated. Perhaps this will be a valuable lesson for whatever career you pursue next, because it will not be in aviation, not with any reputable carrier, once my report on your gross professional misconduct is filed." Davis simply slumped in his seat, his ambitious dreams turning to ash. Finally, Martin fixed his gaze on Captain Frank Miller. "Captain," he said, the word now dripping with irony. "You were in command. You had the ultimate authority. You could have shown integrity. You could have upheld the company's duty to all its clients. Instead, you abused your authority. You used threats to bully a passenger to satisfy another's bigotry. You called my dignity trivial. You called me son." Martin leaned in slightly. "Well, let me tell you something, Frank. Your 30-year career has just been rendered trivial. Your position is terminated. Your license will be challenged. I will personally see to it that the FAA is made aware of your deliberate failure to ensure the safety and fair treatment of all passengers. You are relieved of command." Captain Miller, the decorated veteran, the man of authority, looked utterly broken. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can," Martin replied, his voice a flat, hard line. "I just did. You are all officially dismissed. A corporate security team from our Geneva office is waiting for you at the terminal. They will escort you to a hotel. Your personal belongings will be packed and shipped to you. Do not attempt to contact anyone from the company. Do not attempt to re-enter this aircraft. Is that understood?" 3 shattered, silent nods were his answer. Martin turned and opened the cockpit door without a backward glance. He walked out into the main cabin, past the stunned junior flight attendant, to whom he simply said, "A new crew will be here in 2 hours to fly you home. Cooperate with them." He walked to the exit, picked up his leather bag, and descended the air stairs into the cool Swiss air. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shouted. He had simply delivered a verdict. He had taken a moment of profound personal humiliation and transformed it into an act of absolute surgical power. The crew of Pack 71 thought they had won a small battle over a seat. They never realized they were fighting a war they had already lost. The news of the on-the-spot firing of a veteran Gulfstream crew in Zurich sent an immediate shockwave through the tight-knit world of private aviation. At first it was just whispers, a panicked call from a stranded Brenda O'Malley to a former colleague, a cryptic email from corporate security. But then, at 9:00 a.m. EST, as Martin had planned, the official press release dropped. Etherion Holdings acquires Prestige, air charter in landmark deal. The story hit the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and Reuters simultaneously. The financial world buzzed about the strategic brilliance of the acquisition. But within the aviation industry, a different story was unfolding. The memo Martin had drafted was disseminated to every employee of the former Prestige Air. It announced the change in ownership and, crucially, a zero-tolerance policy towards all forms of discrimination and client mistreatment, effective immediately, coupled with the news of an immediate and total overhaul of corporate culture and operational leadership. For the fired crew stranded in a sterile hotel near Zurich Airport, reality was a nightmare. Their company key cards were deactivated, their corporate credit cards were declined, their work emails were locked. They were ghosts within the system that had employed them just hours earlier. Brenda O'Malley spent the day making frantic calls. She called friends at NetJets and FlexJet, trying to get a feel for her job prospects. The conversations were short and cold. The story, now embellished with every telling, had already poisoned the well. She wasn't just a flight attendant who had been fired. She was the flight attendant who had gotten a whole crew fired by the new billionaire owner on his first day because of a racist incident. She was radioactive. Her 20 years of experience were now worthless, overshadowed by one catastrophic error in judgment. Captain Frank Miller tried to pull rank. He called the FAA liaison for Prestige Air, a man he had known for years. The man was sympathetic, but powerless. "Frank, my hands are tied," he said. The complaint was filed by the owner's office. Not just any owner, but Martin Thorne. They're citing gross professional misconduct and endangerment due to discriminatory practices. Your license is under official review. You'll need a lawyer, a very, very good one. Miller hung up, the word endangerment echoing in his ears. He had threatened to remove a passenger, not for safety, but for prejudice. Thorne's legal team was framing it as creating a hostile and potentially volatile situation at 41,000 feet. His pension, his reputation, his very identity as a captain, it was all evaporating. Co-pilot Robert Davis, the youngest, was perhaps the most terrified. His entire career had been in front of him. He called his wife, his voice cracking, as he tried to explain how he had lost his six-figure job because he had simply stayed quiet. "I didn't do anything," he pleaded, as if that were a defense. He was just beginning to understand that in the face of injustice, doing nothing was a choice, and it had consequences. He was blacklisted before his career had even truly begun. Meanwhile, Harrison Sterling was blissfully unaware of the carnage he had caused. He had a successful lunch meeting, feeling smug about his win on the plane. He considered Brenda a great flight attendant who knew how to handle things. It wasn't until he was in a taxi back to the airport for his commercial flight home that he saw the headline about Aetherian acquiring Prestige Air on his phone. He felt a small, cold knot in his stomach. Aetherian. Martin Thorne. He remembered the quiet, intense man he had forced out of seat 1A. Suddenly the incident didn't seem so trivial. It felt dangerous. He quickly brushed the feeling aside. Thorne was a tech guy. What did he care about some minor seating squabble? Sterling was in private equity. Their worlds barely touched. He was safe. It was an arrogant assumption, and it would prove to be his undoing. Back in Zurich, Martin didn't miss a beat. His meeting with the Swiss robotics firm was flawless. He was focused, charming, and decisive. The deal was signed before dinner. His new acquisition, the source of his earlier humiliation, was already being put to good use. He ordered the newly christened Ascend Air G950 to be flown from Zurich to London, where he had a meeting the next day. A new crew, hand-picked from Aetherian's existing corporate flight department in Europe, was already on their way. They had been briefed on the company's new, non-negotiable standards of service and respect. That evening, in his suite overlooking Lake Zurich, Martin had a video call with David Chen, his CFO, and Eleanor Vance, his notoriously sharp general counsel. "The old guard at Prestige is in chaos," David reported. "The CEO resigned an hour after your email. The board is scrambling. They're terrified." "Good," Martin said. "They should be. Eleanor, what's the status on Sterling?" Eleanor Vance smiled a thin, predatory expression. "Harrison Sterling, CEO of Sterling Holdings. It's a small fry PE firm, relatively speaking. They specialize in leveraged buyouts of manufacturing companies in the Midwest. They have a reputation for being asset strippers. They buy a company, fire half the staff, sell off the equipment, and bankrupt the remains, walking away with a tidy profit." Martin listened, his expression unreadable. "Our AI has been running a deep dive analysis on Sterling Holdings for the last 6 hours, Eleanor continued. It's cross-referencing every SEC filing, every news report, every lawsuit. And it's found some interesting patterns. A lot of his deals rely on one key logistics and transport provider in Ohio, a company called Midwest Freight Solutions." "Get to the point, Eleanor," Martin said. "Midwest Freight is the backbone of his last 3 acquisitions. It's how he moves the assets he strips. And according to our analysis, Sterling Holdings is currently in violation of several debt covenants with its primary lender. They're over-leveraged. If they were to lose the Midwest Freight contract, it would trigger a technical default. Their house of cards would come tumbling down." "Duh." Martin leaned forward, a glint in his eye. "And who owns Midwest Freight Solutions?" David Chen chimed in, a look of awe on his face. "That's the beautiful part, Martin. Nobody important. It's a family-owned business, been around for 50 years, and our AI flags them as a potential acquisition target themselves. They're undervalued and ripe for a tech upgrade. We could buy them for pocket change." The pieces were all there on the board. Sterling had thought his world was separate from Martin Thorne's. He failed to understand that for a man like Martin, whose business was information and analytics, all worlds were connected. "David," Martin ordered, his voice calm and lethal, "draft an offer for Midwest Freight Solutions, a generous one. Pay the family double what it's worth. I want the company under Ethereum's control by the end of the week." Karma wasn't just coming for Harrison Sterling. It was coming with a balance sheet and a hostile takeover. The acquisition of Midwest Freight Solutions by Ethereum Analytics was executed with terrifying speed. It didn't make major headlines. It was a small regional deal, a footnote in the financial press. The founding family was overjoyed, walking away with a life-changing sum of money. To them, Martin Thorne was a savior. To Harrison Sterling, he was about to become a demon. Sterling was in his polished office in Chicago, berating an analyst over poor quarterly projections, when his head of operations burst in his face, pale. "Harrison, we have a problem," he stammered. "A big one." "What is it now?" "Kevin." Sterling snapped, annoyed at the interruption. "Midwest Freight. They just invoked the 30-day termination clause on our contract. All services will cease at the end of next month." Sterling stared at him. "What, they can't do that? We're their biggest client. We made them. Call old man Hemlock and remind him who pays his bills." "I can't," Kevin said, swallowing hard. "The Hemlocks don't own the company anymore. They sold it 3 days ago." A cold dread, the same feeling he'd had in the taxi in Zurich, washed over Sterling. "Sold it to who? A company called Ethereum Analytics." The name hit Harrison Sterling like a physical blow. He slumped back in his leather chair, the color draining from his face. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a targeted strike. The man from the plane, the quiet, humiliated man, was now methodically dismantling his entire business. Losing Midwest Freight was a catastrophe. It was the linchpin of his current projects. Without them, he couldn't move assets from the factories he was stripping. Deadlines would be missed, buyers would back out. The entire predatory cycle of his business model was grinding to a halt. His phone rang. It was his bank. "Harrison Sadihei," said the voice of his long-time banker, his tone grim. "We need to talk about your covenants. Our risk department flagged the termination of the Midwest freight contract. It's a material adverse change. We're going to have to call in your line of credit." This was the kill shot. The technical default Martin's team had predicted was now a reality. With his credit line frozen, Sterling couldn't make payroll for the companies he'd acquired, let alone service his own massive debts. Panic set in. Sterling started selling off assets at fire sale prices, trying to generate cash. But word of his distress was already on the street. The sharks were circling. Competitors smelling blood drove hard bargains. Every deal he made was a losing one. But Martin Thorne wasn't finished. The second part of his plan was already in motion. Eleanor Vance, his general counsel, had compiled a thick dossier on Sterling Holdings. Ethereum's AI hadn't just found business vulnerabilities. It had uncovered a pattern of unethical and potentially illegal activity. It found evidence of pension fund misappropriation at a company Sterling had bankrupted 5 years prior. It found emails detailing a scheme to defraud investors by inflating the value of assets before stripping them. It was a portrait of a corporate predator. This dossier was not sent to the SEC or the Department of Justice. That would have been too direct. Instead, Eleanor leaked it piece by piece to a select group of aggressive, highly respected investigative journalists. The first story broke in the Wall Street Journal, titled "The Sterling Playbook: How a Mid-Tier Raider Profits from Ruin and Betrayed Pensions." The article was a bombshell. It detailed with damning evidence how Sterling had systematically destroyed viable companies, leaving communities devastated and retirees with nothing. The story of the stolen pensions in particular was explosive. It was picked up by national news networks. Suddenly, Harrison Sterling wasn't just a ruthless businessman, he was a villain. Federal regulators, forced into action by the public outcry, announced a formal investigation into Sterling Holdings. The FBI raided their Chicago headquarters, carrying out boxes of documents. His investors, terrified of being associated with the scandal, pulled their money out en masse. His company, once a symbol of his arrogant power, crumbled in a matter of weeks. The karma was absolute. It was not just financial, it was personal. Sterling's name became synonymous with corporate greed. He was shunned at his country club. Old friends stopped taking his calls. He was forced to sell his sprawling mansion to pay his legal fees. He lost the private jet memberships, the fancy cars, the entire facade of success that he had built his identity upon. One rainy Tuesday, a broken and gaunt Harrison Sterling sat in a small rented apartment, the last of his fortune gone. He was watching the news on a small television. A business segment came on, featuring the stunning success of the newly rebranded Ascend Air. The reporter was interviewing its visionary new owner, Martin Thorne. "Mr. Thorne?" The reporter asked. "You've turned this company around in record time. Your new Respect in the Skies initiative is being hailed as a model for the industry. What was the catalyst for such a radical change?" Martin looked into the camera, his expression calm and thoughtful. "I believe that how a company treats the least powerful person in the room is the true measure of its character. My goal is to build an organization where dignity is not a negotiable commodity. Every client, every employee deserves respect. There is no VIP section for that." Watching the screen, Harrison Sterling finally understood. He had not just asked a man to move seats. He had poked a god. He had built an empire on the belief that he was inherently superior, that he could dismiss and disrespect others without consequence, and in one fateful flight, he had chosen the wrong man to disrespect. He had chosen a man who had the power, the intelligence, and the will to not just demand respect, but to command it, and to utterly destroy anyone who dared to deny him it. Sterling turned off the television and sat in the silent, empty room, a man undone by a single sarcastic racist sentence. 6 months after the incident on the flight to Zurich, Martin Thorne sat in seat 1A of a newly refurbished Ascend Air G650. The cabin was no longer a sea of beige and mahogany. It was sleek, modern, with tones of cool grey silver and the deep blue of the Ethereum logo. The atmosphere felt different, not just in decor, but in spirit. The new lead flight attendant, a sharp, professional woman named Sarah, approached him. "Mr. Thorne, we are ready for departure to Tokyo. Can I get you anything before we take off?" "Just water, thank you, Sarah," Martin replied with a warm smile. "Of course. And for your reference, the passenger manifest for this charter is on your tablet. We have confirmed you are the sole passenger, as per your original request." She said it with a quiet emphasis that acknowledged the past without dwelling on it. This was the new protocol, precision, respect, and absolute adherence to the client's contract. As the jet soared over the Atlantic, Martin didn't open his tablet to work. Instead, he looked out the window at the endless blue horizon. The past 6 months had been about more than just retribution. The destruction of Harrison Sterling and the firing of the crew had been a necessary but ultimately unsatisfying part of the process. It was like chemotherapy. The poison was needed to kill the disease, but the goal was the healthy body that came after. The real work had been in the rebuilding. Ascend Air was now the gold standard in private aviation. Martin had poured millions into it, not just on new planes but on people. He had personally overseen the creation of the Ascend Academy, a mandatory, rigorous training program for all employees, from pilots to mechanics to cabin crew. It covered not just safety and service, but also implicit bias training, conflict resolution, and cultural sensitivity. It was taught by leading experts from academia and social justice organizations. He had promoted from within, elevating employees who demonstrated integrity and excellence. The junior flight attendant from that fateful flight, who had been horrified by the crew's behavior, was now a training supervisor at the academy, her story used as a case study in moral courage. But Martin's vision went further. He established the Ascend Foundation, a multi-million-dollar non-profit funded by 10% of Ascend Air's profits. Its mission was to provide scholarships and mentorship programs for women and minorities seeking careers in the aviation industry, a field historically dominated by white men like Frank Miller and Robert Davis. He wasn't just cleaning his own house. He was trying to change the entire neighborhood. As for the old crew, their fates were sealed. Frank Miller lost his pilot's license permanently after an FAA investigation confirmed Martin's complaint. His appeals failed. He ended up selling his house in Connecticut and taking a job as a dispatcher for a regional trucking company, his days of commanding a multi-million-dollar jet a bitter memory. Brenda O'Malley was never hired in aviation again. The story was too infamous. She worked for a time as a hostess in a New Jersey restaurant, the forced smile she had once used on billionaire clients, now deployed for a $2 tip. Robert Davis left the country taking a low-paying co-pilot job for a small cargo airline in Southeast Asia, flying ancient planes over jungles, his dreams of a prestigious career, a distant speck in his rearview mirror. Martin took no pleasure in their ruin. It was simply the logical outcome of their actions, a cause and its unavoidable effect. His focus was on the future, a future he was actively building. His phone chimed with an alert. It was a news update. Harrison Sterling had just been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. The final nail in the coffin. Martin read the headline, his expression unchanging. He closed the alert and looked back out the window at the curve of the earth. He had faced down a moment of ugly, naked prejudice designed to make him feel small and out of place. But they had misjudged him. They thought he was a guest in their world, when in fact he was in the process of buying it. He had taken their poison and turned it into an antidote not just for himself, but for an entire industry. He was Martin Thorne. He was the CEO of Ethereum Analytics and the owner of Ascend Air. And he was exactly where he belonged. This wasn't just a story about revenge. It was a story about consequences. It shows how the quiet, casual poison of prejudice, the kind that happens every day in offices, on airplanes, and in boardrooms, can unleash a catastrophic chain of events when it meets a person of unshakable resolve and immense power. Martin Thorne didn't just get mad, he got strategic. He didn't just fire a crew, he ripped out the entire corrupt system that empowered them and built something better in its place. He turned a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for industry-wide change. What do you think? Was his response justified, or did he go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of ultimate karma and righteous justice resonated with you, please do us a huge favor and hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story.